Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time around we are going to be taking a look at attributes in more detail. And so attributes are something that we can use and they can be applied to functions, they can be applied to variables is going to be the most common use case we see. We can apply them to entire classes, even entries in an enum, and they allow us to do extra things. That's really sort of the main goal of. They're a big sort of value add for being able to often improve the usability of something or improve the robustness of something. So let's dive on in and take a look at setting some up. So what I've done so far is this is just a bare bones empty project. We're just going to use this as sort of our test bed for working with this. So I'm just going to create a script, and I'm going to call this demo component A, just because I want to have a script that I can attach onto stuff. So let's take a look at this to start off with. What we're going to look at first is attributes that we can apply to this entire class, and in particular to a mono behavior based one. So looking at the attributes that we can apply to this particular class, the first thing I'm actually going to do to make it so we've got a couple of extra options here, I'm going to also create a demo component B. Now I'm not going to really do anything with the code for that. The main reason I wanted to create that is one of the very common ones that I do make use of is, say we've got a particular component we're attaching and it has a dependency on another type of component. So it might be something that we're attaching to a button and we want to make sure it is actually a button that it's being placed on. What we can do is we can do require component type of, now in my case I'm going to do demo component B. What this will do is if we go and take a look at the behavior of this. So, okay, I'm going to create an empty game object. If I drag demo component A onto it, so it requires component B, but it's not currently attached, what happens is the component B gets attached first. The other thing that happens is if I try to remove A, that will be fine. But if I undo that and try to remove B, I can't because there is that dependency there. So require component is really handy for scenarios like of that. Now, I can also then, let's see what happens if I drag component A back onto this and it doesn't go and recreate B because B is already there. So require component, super handy for scenarios where you want to be able to ensure that a particular thing exists. That's really great for if we're doing something like in our start or awake, doing a get component to retrieve something else. If we have done require component, we can make the assumption that it has to be there because Unity is enforcing that in multiple areas, which is really handy. The other thing is okay, well, when we're attaching a script onto something, if we go to add component, we've got a lot of different categories here. And if we're adding in our own scripts and we've got a large project, that can get a little unwieldy, trying to remember the name to type in. What would be great is if we can extend that menu, and we actually can. So what I can do is I can go add component menu, and then I can say, okay, well, my components, and this is going to be demo component A. And if I really want, what I could also do is I could add this in to our demo component B, like that. So that's good. We've got that set up in it. Then what I'll find is when I go to add component, I've now got this entry here, and I can select my particular one. Super handy, makes it possible for us to, keep our projects organized and neat. We can also then make it much quicker and easier to find our particular code without having to remember the name of it, which is a big thing because in a very large project in particular, you can end up with a lot of things that are similarly named, and this avoids running into errors with that. Now, the other thing is it can be very easy to accidentally drag a second copy of the same component onto something. And that's something that there are cases where we do want to support that. So for example, that's something where when I'm working often with AI behaviors, I actually specifically want to support multiple often of the same thing on there. But there are also cases where that wouldn't be safe to do. Say it's a script that's handling additional logic for a button. It wouldn't make sense to have multiple copies of that handler script on the same button, and it could also cause us issues. So we can actually prevent multiple of something being added. So what I can do is I can go disallow multiple component. So by putting that attribute there, what it means is whereas before I could have added multiple of A, if I try to now, it actually won't let me. So simple little things that we can add there in terms of working with the component, but they allow us to make some assumptions in our code and know that Unity is enforcing them. They also allow us to make it an easier experience in the inspector side of things, working with stuff, and a safer side of your experience there, which is always good. Anything we can do to prevent errors being introduced and prevent people linking up things incorrectly, that saves time. That's time we don't need to spend later on tracking down bugs caused by it. So always good to be able to do things like that where we can. Now there's further things that we can do. And like I said, a lot of the stuff with attributes is focused on being able to make things easier to work with. So for example, let's set up some variables here. So, okay, color is one where there is actually a specific attribute that we can use with color variables that are configurable. So what that is, and I'll set up a couple of ones here. We have color1. Now, if I just have that and we go and take a look and see what that looks like, that is my normal color that supports alpha. So fairly sort of standard there. We've seen that a lot. But what if I want people to be able to select a color, but I don't want them to be able to configure an alpha channel for it? What I can do is I can do color usage and false. That will turn off showing of the alpha channel. So if I take a look at that now, we can see I can't set an alpha value for this. And even my hexadecimal display down there has reduced to just the 3 components. So things like that can be really handy for when you're wanting to restrict the behavior. But also, there's more than just that change we can do with the color side of things, because we've also got support for setting HDR, high dynamic range colors. And neither of those color entries we saw there supported high dynamic range. So if we want to support that, what we can do is there is another parameter to this. So the second one controls whether it is a HDR color. So to do the full set of ones, so we're showing all of the possible configurations that we can do with this, like that. So now if we take a look, we'll see color 3 and 4 are high dynamic range ones. They have the intensity setting, which these other ones don't. And color 3 has no alpha channel, but color 4 does. So that's good. We've got those being able to select the colors using the proper methods that we would want to, depending upon what we're working with. There are cases where we've been working with stuff where things have wanted a HDR color as an input. Particularly common, you might find it with post-processing, things like of that, or some shaders. So being able to configure that directly in the script is really handy. So that's good. But if we wanted to provide a bit of, we can name these, but we might want to give a little bit more context for a particular thing. We can do that using, there is a tooltip attribute. So this is the tooltip for color 1. We can set up ones for each of our different ones here. And this allows us to just give a little bit of extra info for those particular variables, which we'll see those when I mouse over the name for it. I can actually see that tooltip will appear, which is really handy. And it'll appear over the actual value also. So tooltips, especially if you are creating something that is more sort of user-facing, in particular if it's going to be used by folks who are not going to be working directly with the code or might not be as familiar with code, providing context for your variables that are configurable there is really valuable. I particularly recommend doing that for if there's anything sort of strange. Like a common thing that we'll often end up doing is you might have a floating point value. And it might be a case of, okay, a negative value means that this parameter is not being used, but a positive value or anything greater than 0 means it is being used. Putting that in a tooltip is really handy because folks might be looking for a way to turn something off and it might not be obvious. So especially if there's something that's a little bit not immediately obvious, doing the actual sort of tooltips there, really handy. Highly recommend it. Doesn't take long to do. We can also group things nicely as well. So we can use this header one. Now header doesn't it needs to be before a particular variable, but it will apply to essentially everything after that. The other one I can do, just so we can see it being used at the same time, is there is also one that I can do, space, that will, as we'll see, create a little bit more of a buffer. So we've got our color, got our additional space between the non-HDR and HDR colors, so that's worked. So all of these are really about actually just sort of laying things out, making it easier and clearer to work with. We do have some general things for, if we create another one for ranges, I can do range 0 to 1, and have a public float 1. And that what that will do is that will actually give me a slider for it. It's going to take a little bit. So with this case, I get an actual slider, and that gives me that limit for the range there. If I might make that float 2, and I'll just put float 1, because what we'll see is we don't actually get that for float 1. It will just have the numerical entry, which is fine. There are cases where that's what we want. But if you know that a value has very specific ranges, I really recommend using that range attribute there. Just avoids potential errors. And if I try to set a value that is outside of its range, it just goes and clamps it back to being within the range, which is great. So keeps things a lot easier to actually work with. There's other stuff that I can do as well. So for example, say we've got a extra setting down here, and we'll call this colors with helpers. So I'm going to create a public color, color5, and what I can do is I can say, okay, I want to create a context menu item, and I'm going to call this reset to white, and we'll call this reset color 5 to white actually, and then that. Now this second parameter that I'm providing here, this must be a valid function name. So it's very important that with that second parameter that you provide there, you need to make sure that it follows all of the normal conventions for being able to actually execute, or to be a valid function name, essentially. This. Then what I do is I can create functions down here. Like that. And that will go, okay, color5 is color.white. Then we have our second one. So similar process. Now let's see how that actually gets used and how that behaves. So, okay, I can go and I can see nothing here, just looks normal. If I right click on this though, I can say, okay, we'll reset that to white, or reset it to black. If I right click on any of these other ones, nothing appears. It's tied to that particular property. So that's a really handy thing. What this allows, and I can just remove the extra text because we've shown that it's specific to that particular property. This just means if there are particular things that you might want to be doing there, like resetting to particular colors, things like that, you can do that via setting up these context menu items. So super handy little thing that you can be doing there. So, okay. We've worked with ranges, we've worked with tooltips, we've worked with context menu items, stuff, things like that. The other thing that we can do, and this is something that can come in handy, is enums don't always, we might end up changing the display name of stuff, things like that. And what we can do, I'm going to set up a test enum. Now, I'm going to just create some terribly named entries. Autocomplete doing me a solid and generating a whole bunch of ones. And let's create another header here for enums. And we'll do a public enum like of that. So, okay, that if we take a look, that just appears the way we normally expect it to. But what I can do is I can actually say, well, inspector name, default for this one, for example. This one, I might decide, okay, inspector name, and maybe this one's deprecated. We can see stuff like that. Maybe this one has, different name, and this might be minimum. Who knows? Doesn't really matter for the particular context. It's just a case of where what happens is we can see that now is default. We can see different things here deprecated. So this is really, really handy. Lets us actually give a bit more context for the particular values here. So we can use a name that works well in code, but then we can clean up and change how that looks at runtime. Well, sorry, for the inspector side of things. And that's also something that we can update without sort of messing with any other code that's using the enum, because it's purely a cosmetic display thing. So super, super handy. So, okay, that's colors, ranges, context. Let's look at a few other ones, because one of the other things that does come in handy, I find, is with text. So with text, we've got a couple of things that we can be doing. If I have two public strings here, which I'll create three, text1, text2, and text3. Now, what I'm going to do for text2 is I'm going to say that it is a text area. And then for 3, it's going to be a text area, but this attribute allows us to set the minimum and maximum number of lines. So I might go for 1 and 10. So let's see the different behavior between these. So, okay, let's edit our text1. Let's put in A and B and C. And so if I press enter, it just actually stops editing it. Doesn't support having multiple lines there. Text2, but that was the one where we just said text area. We didn't provide any values. So I can do A, B, C, D. We can see it's immediately going to scrolling as soon as I have more than 3 lines. Now, text3 was the one where we said 1, 10 in that attribute. So it started off with space for 1 row, but then it expands and expands, and it will keep expanding until we get to 10, and we can see then it switched over to now we've got a scroll bar. So this is really good for if you're working with paragraphs of text. You want to be using a text area generally for setting these up. It makes editing of them a lot easier. And you can use either approach here. This is usually my go-to, just because I get the advantage of it being really compact if it's a small amount of text. But if it's a large amount of text, then I can actually see most of it there at that particular point in time, which is handy. So, okay, that's good. We've seen how we can use the attributes for controlling sort of the appearance of things, everything like of that. There's a couple of other areas that we can actually work with the attributes that are really handy too. And so what we're going to work with is properties, because one of the things with this, we generally want to try and avoid making things public unless we absolutely need to, because something that's made public, yes, we can edit it in the inspector, which is great, but that also means that it's visible to every other bit of code. And kind of the general convention that's followed with code is if something is publicly accessible, that you should assume that it's safe to be able to be modifying it at any point in time. And that's not always going to be the case. So what we want to do at times is be able to have stuff be editable, but not have it actually be able to be visible to other code. And so we can do that. I can mark something as serialized field, and then even though this is private, I will still be able to actually see it in the inspector, and it will still be serialized, which is really good. Taking a bool here, we've made it private, but we've marked it with this serialized field. And normally, something that's private, we wouldn't be able to see it in the inspector, and also changes to it wouldn't persist. They wouldn't get remembered and saved out. But as soon as we do serialized field, they can be. So this is really handy. This allows us to have something that is visible to anyone configuring this script in the inspector, which is great, super useful. But it also then means that that variable is not visible to things in the code, which is good as well. That allows us to have a bit more robustness there with the code and only have things that need to be accessible. But sometimes we kind of need a bit more of a middle ground. Sometimes we actually need to be able to make something so that it is able to be read from external things, but can't be set from external things. So the normal way we would do that is something like a property. So we'd have testable. I'm going to call this testable3 because I want to actually have just a private testable1 here, just to make it very clear that it's not going to be visible in the inspector. So this one won't be visible, this one will be. This one, I'm going to make it a property. So the way we would normally use a property to have something be restricted is it would be public, and then we have our get, and then we would do either a private set or a protected set typically. The thing that usually decides that for me is if this is going to be a class that I'm going to be inheriting from a lot, then I would typically use a protected set, unless it was something that I felt it was unsafe for child classes to actually be modifying. But in this case, I'm not intending this to be inherited from, so I'm going to make it a private set. So this gives us a variable that it's going to be publicly gettable, privately settable, but what I'll find when I go to the inspector, let's get that there again, I can see testball2. I can't see testball1, which is correct, but I also can't see testball3. So that, and also this, I need to move that down so it's properly grouping things. So this is less than ideal. But what I can do is I can actually say, okay, serialize field, doing that won't actually fix it. But what I do is I go field, and then I can say serialize field. Because what this does is that applies these attributes to the field that is backing this property. So properties have a backing field, and this allows me to apply attributes to them. We can see we can actually apply multiple ones. So I can apply serialize field. I'm going to make this a public float, and we will call that test float 4 is probably, I'll call that actually float 3. I'll do the same thing. I can also then go, okay, well, range, and then 0 to 1. Now, I don't recall 100% the syntax of whether it needs to be a field again for that. We'll actually find out. Looks like no. But we can see testball3 appears there, which is good. And, we can just do a double check. Okay, what if we just did that? Does it actually still work? And we don't actually see it at all, which is what we should expect to see happen. So using this field specifier allows us to apply an attribute or multiple attributes to a backing field. That is really handy. That allows us to have properties where we can actually be setting them in the inspector, which is great, always handy. We can have them be publicly gettable by other sections of code, also often really handy, but we can restrict who's actually able to set them. And that gives us sort of a really good combo. So this scenario, I actually use this quite a bit these days in my own code because it allows just a very clean syntax, I find. The final other thing that we can do is, say we have a public variable that might just be for debugging and we don't want it to be serialized. So this might be, we'll call this testball4. I won't have any of that. But say I don't want that serialized. I could go system non-serialized, like that. And what will happen is that will not be visible here, but other bits of code will be able to access it, and it will not get saved out. This is something that I find when I'm working with scriptable objects in particular. Scriptable objects can be a little finicky, and at times they have a bit of a tendency to save things that they've actually not been told to save. I've run into quite a bit at times, scriptable objects saving even private variables because of how just weird sort of quirks of how some of the stuff was working with it. So especially when I'm working with data stored in scriptable objects, and because I often will use them where that scriptable object might be doing further logic and generating additional data, that additional data, if I don't want it to be saved, I will often mark it as a system non-serialized, even when it is a private variable, just to make sure that it is never getting saved at all. So really, really handy. So that's a big run through of a bunch of the common useful attributes, things to make it so that our inspector looks better, things to make it so that our inspector is more robust, we don't have as many problems that we could run into, and also ways of making our code interfaces cleaner and more robust there as well, all of which are super handy. So I will put a link in the description to a page that has a bunch of attributes that you can use in the inspector. There'll actually be two links that I make use of there. One is attributes that are primarily for this side of things, that are ones that affect, directly just stuff in the inspector or maybe runtime behavior, things like that. The other are going to be a set of ones that are geared towards being used for the editor. So you use those for things like a custom editor for a particular class that you've got exposed. So I haven't dived into those in this. I might look at those separately if that's something that folks are interested in. It's less commonly used, but it is an area that there are some useful ones there that you have seen me, if you've watched other videos, make use of those other ones, but I do find they're ones that don't use as commonly as the ones that I've run through here. But dive on in and experiment with this. See how these could be applied to your own code. See what things there you can make use of to make that all work better. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, check and like and subscribe. Really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, that code is available up on GitHub. There is a link in the description below. You can use the code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you have any questions on the code or on the project, then chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description as well. But until next time, bye.